All right, so I think we'll get started. I'm sure some other people will be joining in shortly. But welcome, everyone. On behalf of react19.org and the Vaccine Injured, I want to welcome Dr. Brandon Horn. He will be speaking to us about working with mast cell activation syndrome, an integrative medicine approach. Brandon is a lecturer, researcher, and clinician in the fields of Chinese medicine and functional medicine. His educational background includes 3 doctorate degrees. He has a PhD, a JD, and a Doctor of Traditional Chinese Medicine. He has publications in peer-reviewed medical journals and has co-authored a chapter in an acclaimed functional medicine textbook, Integrative and Functional Medical Nutrition Therapy, published by Springer Publications. Brandon spent 8 years on the faculty at UCLA Medical School as a lecturer teaching third-year medical students. He worked at Children's Hospital of Los Angeles for 9 years, primarily in rheumatology, endocrinology, and pain management. Brandon is currently in private practice and in recent years has spent a considerable amount of time treating COVID, long COVID, and vaccine injuries. Everything presented today is for informational and educational purposes only. Read the research, talk with your doctor, and make informed decisions about your health care. Please welcome Dr. Brandon Horn.
Thank you. Okay. So today we're gonna look at, as you mentioned, an integrative approach to mast cell activation syndrome. So we have a bit of material to cover here. I didn't have time to make perfect slides, so my apologies for that, but much of the material that I have there is cited, at least the things that may not be obvious. And I want to focus more on some things that you may not get through just reading an article on MCAS. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on pathogenesis and how that works, because that can really help make a difference in treatments, particularly where treatment has been focused on symptomatic resolution and in those cases where it hasn't been necessarily satisfactory. So which is, I assume, is why people would be listening to this anyways. So let's start with this idea of mast cell activation syndrome. Now, I'm coming from a Chinese medicine perspective. So when I say integrative approach, it really means equally integrating clinical and scientific data without prejudice, right? Because if we look at Chinese medicine, it was never actually separated from any new scientific discoveries, because in ancient China, there was nothing else. It was just medicine, right? It wasn't Chinese medicine. And they did surgeries, they had vaccines hundreds of years before other medical systems began using them. And I'm not saying one system is superior to another. I'm just saying that true medicine, kind of like true knowledge, should not reject anything for tribalist reasons. So this is, just as a definition of what I'm calling integrative. Now, I'll be giving you some data on herbs and formulations and so forth that can directly affect mast cell degranulation and sensitivity and all that. And that'll perhaps give some of you some more options to integrate into the current way you're approaching treatment. But what I really want to do here is give you a perspective that may help you not just in the management of your symptoms, but to better understand them and to potentially help resolve some of the underlying mechanisms that led to your development of MCAS in the first place. So let's sort of jump right in here. Now, to understand MCAS, the first thing to notice is that it's a syndrome, right? And by definition, at least technically, we call something a syndrome instead of a disease where we don't have a solid understanding of what's causing it, right? More technically, we say that we don't know the etiology, right? So with MCAS, the underlying causal mechanism is unknown, yet the definition of MCAS is fairly strict, right? Because you have these sort of cluster of symptoms, things like flushing and itching, sinus problems, hives, angioedema, headaches, and so forth. And then to be officially diagnosed with MCAS, you need to fulfill these sort of 3 criteria. Meaning you have to have at least 2 organ systems involved, and then we need to have a laboratory confirmation, and then we need a favorable response to drugs. So we discussed the first one, and in terms of the laboratory confirmation, the dogma is that we need to have an increase, for example, in serum tryptase, which is the usual one, or histamine or prostaglandin D2. And then the question, of course, is why are these the labs, right? And the answer is because mast cells secrete these when they degranulate, and we can measure them and be at least somewhat confident they're coming from mast cells, right? But there's a catch. The catch is that mast cells can release over 1,000 different chemicals. And here we're only looking at less than a handful of chemicals. So in other words, many people with the same constellation of symptoms may have their mast cells releasing very different chemicals than someone else. And what mast cells release can be highly individualized. So laboratory confirmation is a fairly dubious criteria to rule people out. They can rule people in, but so we call those people that we rule them out in some ways suspected MCAS, but they don't get a definitive diagnosis that way. And by the way, it's not necessarily easy to properly collect these samples because, when you're collecting the samples, they require extremely cold temperatures, right? Because they're volatile compounds that can evaporate and break down. So they need to be kept cold the entire way. And then there's this thing that the tryptase, for example, has a half-life of just a couple hours. So you have to collect it shortly after the event. So it's not always, easy to, to get a good solid sample and diagnosis. And then finally, they have to respond to treatment, right? And this is a tough one because, people are, they're very individual in which combination that they're going to respond to. And many people I see aren't responding to anything because, well, people usually want to go through insurance first, and then they come to me if that doesn't work. So I have somewhat of a biased sample of patients in my practice. But one thing I've noticed is that MCAS is a bit of a murky diagnosis. Now, a little later, we're going to talk about mast cells and what's happening, and then some treatment approaches. But before we get there, we need to have some background on how this develops, because that can give us some kind of understanding of how to approach treatment and even possibly reverse MCAS rather than just manage the symptoms. All right. So to understand all of this, we first have to take a step back a little bit and have some background as to how it can develop. And here, Chinese medicine has a lot to add because we have useful descriptions both of how post-viral syndromes develop, as well as how vaccine injuries can develop. Now, these have some similarities and some differences. And if you don't understand what's happening, then the resolution may be difficult or impossible because every time your body tries to resolve it and you become more symptomatic, you're going to counter the body's response and it won't ever resolve. Because some people are going to go through symptom exacerbations before they get better. And it's important to understand why. Now, people understandably have this aversion to symptoms. Symptoms are uncomfortable by definition, but symptoms are often the body trying to resolve a problem. Most symptoms come from inflammatory responses, with the key word being responses, right? These are responses by the immune system. So in conventional medical approaches, we tend to vilify the body's response to pathology, right? And to its attempts to repair itself. Why? Because this is inflammation. And we tend to think whatever the body does that causes discomfort is some kind of pathology, meaning the symptom itself is pathologic, right? Chinese medicine is the opposite. So we look at symptoms as usually physiological, meaning that they're physiological responses. And the assumption is that the body sees things that we may not. And so Chinese medicine, in terms of their approach, is often to try to support the body rather than to counteract it. Now, we do, of course, recognize that the body can go overboard and have inappropriate responses. Things like anaphylaxis are almost always inappropriate. Even the cytokine storms, which we see with some of the severe cases of COVID, right? these are inappropriate and exaggerated responses of the body. But again, we look at these as the exception and not the rule. Whereas it's a little bit different in conventional medicine. It's sort of the opposite, really. There's this assumption that the symptoms are bad and that we need to get rid of them, okay? So let's take a look at how these kinds of things happen, meaning how do we develop these symptoms that we call MCAS? And so we'll explore this for context by discussing a little bit about long COVID and some ideas of how vaccines may induce MCAS as well. All right, so long COVID is a kind of amorphous term. And interestingly, some of the studies have found that a significant amount of long COVID sufferers were never actually exposed to the virus, meaning the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? Now, this may be puzzling, but it's only puzzling because we call it long COVID, right? As if somehow it's unique to COVID, but it's not. That's just a sort of marketing phrase because really, we have long just about every kind of respiratory virus, right? But we call it post-viral syndrome rather than long flu or long HRV or long other coronavirus or whatever. And these kinds of post-viral syndromes have been happening really since the beginning of time. Now, to be very clear, that doesn't minimize how life-altering they can be. It's just to say that it's not something new, right? In fact, you can find descriptions of this happening with influenza and other respiratory viruses in the conventional medical literature, at least back to the 1970s, right? Chinese medical literature, they've described these things thousands of years ago. But they also describe the various ways that it happens, right? And how different groups of symptoms are indicative of the level that a pathogen has invaded your body into. So, okay, so let's take a look at how this works. Now, I have a sort of a diagram here that I grabbed off of another slide I presented in a Chinese medicine lecture. So it looks a little confusing initially, but it's actually pretty straightforward. So basically, we start with this pathogen there at the top, the kind of yellow fuzzy thing here. And as the pathogen invades the body, there are three basic ways it can deal, that the body can deal with it initially. So this term Wei Qi, really you can read that as the immune system, or in this portion, it's more like the innate immune system, but anyway. So our bodies have various layers of defenses. And under the best of circumstances, when a pathogen invades, the body immediately kills it and you never get infected, right? So that's the green here on the left. That's a relatively strong innate immune response. And when I say relative, it means that the pathogen is weaker than the immune system, right? Whatever level your immune system is at when you're invaded, then that's where you would gauge relative off of. Now, it's worth noting that the strength of the pathogen is not just the type of organism, but it's also the load of the pathogen as well, the viral load. So, a very high viral load can overwhelm even a strong immune system. And this is why, masks, for example, there was all this controversy over whether masks do anything or don't do anything. Well, they do. So even if a mask doesn't help you prevent you from getting infected because the virus is airborne, it's at least going to reduce the load of mucus particles and so forth that are going to arrive at you. And so this can make a big difference in whether your immune system is overwhelmed or not initially. So as you can see, there are other color, the gray color down below with the deficient Wei Qi, what it says, deficient immunity, and then the moderate immunity for the orange. Now, it's very interesting because most people who get sick, they're in the orange, right? Because if your immune system is really deficient, actually, you're not going to get symptoms, right? Or not, much that you'll notice. You don't even know you've been infected. So this is kind of the catch, that a really strong immune system and a really weak immune system are both going to present relatively asymptomatically, right? However, even though the initial symptoms are the same, the results are very different, right? So this is how people get long COVID who have mild or no symptoms at all. I know you guys have probably heard about that. This is sort of a scare thing. Oh, it's infecting people who don't even know they've been infected, right? And this is how that happens. And keep in mind that deficient immune system can also be temporary, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. So once you get sick, and then the battle sort of starts, which symptom set that you're going to get will depend on where the battle takes place and which type of weapon the immune system feels is optimal to deploy against the given threat. So as an example, a common example, fever, right? A fever is employed if the pathogen replication seems to be better at cooler temperatures, right? That's one of the reasons why you'll get fever. And this is largely what happens with the respiratory viruses because the sinus cavity and the upper airways are cooler, right? And so if you turn the temperature up, then because these viruses replicate much better, and again, at cooler temperatures, that when you turn the temperature up, it inhibits the virus's ability to replicate, and then it greatly increases the chances that the body will defeat the virus before it's able to invade deeper. Again, these things can replicate extremely rapidly when the conditions are good for them. And the problem with these viruses invading deeper is that, well, I mean, so what I mean first by deeper, right? That can be a little complicated, but to give you some idea, there are actually areas in the body that are immune privileged, like, for example, the central nervous system. Actually, we're starting to find it's not completely privileged, but there are very different kinds of immune responses, as you can imagine why. But these kind of issues and even peripheral nerves can get infected, for example. And once they're invaded, they tend to be compartments that viruses can reside in for life, right? They've sort of made it. And we see this, for example, with the herpes virus family, right? You see things like varicella, which is the virus that causes chickenpox and shingles, right? And herpes simplex viruses that cause the cold sores and genital herpes and so forth, Epstein-Barr virus, you know, cytomegalovirus and so forth. So this is why innate immunity is so important, because even if you have adaptive immunity, you still need a strong innate immune system to prevent the infections and to prevent them from getting into these kinds of areas. And this point becomes important also in understanding the pathogenesis of vaccine injuries, right? Because some of the vaccines, of course, can injure people because of, let's say, too much toxin accumulation. So some of the vaccines, for example, that have a lot of aluminum in them, like HPV vaccine, Gardasil is one example. Furthermore, some of these vaccines have been shown to prevent symptoms, but not infection, right? So we see this with the SARS vaccines, right? So now also we see this with the pertussis vaccine, for example. It's the when you get the pertussis vaccine with the pertussis disease, it's the symptom actually that kills people. So if you prevent the symptom, then you prevent the death. And that's important, of course, but pertussis is not particularly deadly for anyone, let's say, over 6 months old, right? However, people who are vaccinated for pertussis, they're not immune to being infected with pertussis. They actually do get infected and they can spread it, but they don't become symptomatic themselves typically, okay? So, and this, again, it's the same with with COVID, right? But these asymptomatic infections, they may or may not be benign, right? So there is some research now showing that these asymptomatically infected individuals, for example, with Bordetella pertussis, they had higher incidences of multiple sclerosis, and there are other things that can happen. And this is going to lead into some of our discussion of how vaccines could induce MCAS-like symptoms, right? Of course, the mRNA and the DNA vaccines are different in that they're not, technically they're not vaccines, they're more gene therapy, and that's semantics really, but it matters because the mode of damage can be different. So clinically, it may make a difference in how you're going to approach it, but we'll get into that in a minute. So back to this idea of the strength of the immune system, the relative strength of the immune system. And back to this idea of the initial attack, the fever. If we knock out a fever with, say, Tylenol or whatever, then we have basically created an iatrogenic cause of illness, right? We inhibited the body's defenses, this defense mechanism, and because of that, the virus was able to invade deeper and lead to chronic disease rather than just having acute discomfort of having a fever, right? So you can see that this can happen because either your immune system itself is weak relative to the strength of the pathogen, or it can happen because we make the immune system weaker by treating the body symptomatically, right? And I remember I learned this lesson very early on in my career when I treated my first AIDS patient. So when his CD4 counts nosedived, he felt great. He had no allergies. he had very little inflammation, and then we're treating him and his CD4 counts start coming up and he starts feeling horrible, right? So you have to be really careful about understanding what you're observing, right? And this is really why it's the practice of medicine, because each person is different and you need to try to understand what's going on. And that's really the job of a clinician, not to be an automaton, but to think about each patient individually, because many times things that seem like they're getting worse may actually be getting better. So, okay, so then the next concept that we have in Chinese medicine is that where the body gets attacked depends in significant part on the person's underlying strengths and weaknesses. So for example, a respiratory virus will initially attack most people in the same way, but one person may have, say, a weakness in their digestive system and another person in their nervous system, and the virus will end up entering into your weak points. And so the presentation will be different in different people once you cross the initial barriers, right? And it's not just with the virus, right? So the vaccine also is the same thing. So with the mRNA vaccines, for example, they inject these lipid nanoparticles, the LNPs, and they told us, of course, that it all stays in the deltoid, right? That was what they told us initially. Well, it turns out that that was sort of a lie in a way, and I'm saying a lie because the government agencies themselves had disclosures from Pfizer that the biodistribution of lipid nanoparticles was all over the body, especially into the liver, the spleen, and even the ovaries, right? But this was never mentioned because they emphatically stated that there was absolutely no evidence it could, let's say, impact fertility, or remember that there was a whole argument about the fertility, and without data, they were emphatic about it. So at any rate, where it gets distributed in any one person is going to depend on how their body handles it. So in one person, it could bioaccumulate in the liver, in another person in the ovaries or brain or wherever. And so subsequently, these so-called vaccine reactions can then be varied to a very large degree. Next, of course, with the vaccines, there was the spike protein. Those are produced after the LNPs get into the cells, whichever cells they end up in, and they deliver the mRNA to code for it, right? So then the spike gets expressed on the cell surface and the body creates antibodies, and then the killer T cells come around and destroy the cells that are producing the spike, which ends up not being so great if the LNPs accumulated in your ovaries or in your nervous system. But anyway, if it's in your deltoid, perhaps not so bad. But anyway, that's the general idea of what's supposed to happen in there. But then came along these, the crazies who said that the spike protein, might be toxic, or that it was toxic. And they said that if vaccines could, they said, what if vaccines could cause infertility or cardiovascular problems? Or what if this gene therapy incorporates into your own, turns into DNA, incorporates into your DNA? And that didn't go over well with the CDC. And what we saw was a kind of censoring of dissenting scientific opinion. And studies came out showing that the spike was no longer found in the body 2 weeks after immunization anyways, and that it's just basic biology. The translation goes from DNA to RNA to protein and not the other way around. Well, maybe we shouldn't have censored the dissenting opinions, because eventually some researcher groups started seeing that the spike protein was persisting long-term after vaccination. And it turned out that the reason it wasn't found in the original studies was that the antibodies were grabbing the spike protein, and the technology they used to measure it wasn't able to see the proteins that were bound to antibodies, only free proteins. So when we used the correct technology, we found that the spike was persisting long-term. But how could that happen, right? The cells producing the spike should have been destroyed a long time ago. Well, it turns out that another recent study showed that under controlled conditions, at least, meaning this was an in vitro study, that within 6 hours of introducing Pfizer's mRNA vaccine to a cell line, the mRNA was reverse transcribed into DNA. In other words, this showed that conceptually, the vaccines made a template that could allow for continued production of spike in some people. Now, we don't know if it was actually integrated into the genome because those studies haven't been done yet, but this could also be one explanation for how spike could continuously be produced and be a trigger for MCAS. So why? Because we found, to sort of tie it into the MCAS, we found in severe COVID that tended to involve IgE antibodies to the spike, right? And that it also induced mast cell activation. So the spike itself could be a trigger for the development of MCAS. And of course, spike could be either relative to a vaccine or relative to being infected, either way. So another scenario for developing symptoms of MCAS is through cross-reactivity. And there's a group of Ojdani and Karazian. They looked at cross-reactivity to the S1 protein, and they found that the spike antibody, S1 antibodies, cross-reacted with a number of important proteins that are involved in energy production, mitochondrial proteins, cardiovascular health, neurological health, and so forth. So these are the basic scenarios. And now we can take a look at why mast cells are involved, right? So first, this is going to require us to understand in a way what they do in the body, and then we can go into some treatments. All right. So, okay, so mast cells, for many people, it's a four-letter word. But it turns out that mast cells are pretty amazing cells. They do amazing things in the body. They're white blood cells, and they come from the bone marrow and they mature in local tissues. They live up to several months, and they contain, as we mentioned, over 1,000 different chemicals. So I like to think of it more like a car. If you have all these buttons and each button does something different, so you want to turn left and you can signal to tell the car with the left turn signal, you press that down and the turn signal goes on. Or you want to turn on the air conditioning, you press a button, give an input, and then the car knows to turn on the air conditioning and so forth. And that's, really in a way, that's really kind of like how mast cells are. And, certain people have particular things they like while they're driving. They have particular habits or patterns that they use as they're driving. And in a similar way, we have particular patterns about how and when our mast cells are going to respond and release various chemicals. So basically, mast cells are involved in a lot of things here. So they're involved in, regulating blood pressure. They help to oxygenate tissue. So these are crucial functions in the body. They also stimulate angiogenesis, which is needed to heal things in the body and can treat things like peripheral artery diseases and treat ischemic heart disease. And while angiogenesis is something that cancers use as well, and mast cells could be involved in this, they also contribute to killing tumors. So mast cells are also very important in bone growth and bone remodeling. They play important roles in fracture repair. There's actually even some evidence that it has a role in erections through histamine production. So, but on the flip side, they found increases in mast cells have been associated with arthritis. But even in that case, it's not entirely clear if the mast cells are causative or if they're there to help repair. Other things, EMF exposure can actually induce mast cell degranulation. So it's worth checking your house for sources of EMFs. If you have that, that's a fairly long discussion. But if you have questions about that, you can ask that at the end, and I can go into a lot more sort of details on that if you need. And then what else here? Okay, so mast cells and pathogen control, they're very important in pathogen control, and they're particularly important in our initial immune response. So taking things to inhibit mast cells at the beginning of a viral infection may not necessarily be the best idea. So there's a doctor from South Africa. I wish I remember his name. I don't recall his name offhand. He's a brilliant guy. And he would actually hold off on antihistamines until day 8 of the infection, and then he started administering them. And that allowed full use of the mast cells during the initial stages of the infection when they were needed to fight the virus. And then once they started turning it, more pathological and causing these cytokine issues, he would, turn it around. He would head it off by doing it on day 8, but he would turn it around and then start administering all these sort of anti, I guess, mast cell antihistamines and so forth at that time. So I wanted everyone to understand basically the importance of mast cells and that perhaps they're activating due to chronic infection and things like that in order to help control the virus and to help prevent it from causing more damage, or they could be there to help repair damage. And this is where, this is where we can solve the problem. If we can figure out what the mast cells are there trying to do, we don't necessarily need to inhibit them, but if we can help them, for example, kill residual virus, if that's one of the causes. And it's one of the causes in many cases where people don't think that they have the virus. As a matter of fact, recently I read a study where there was a paper where they took dogs and they trained them to sniff out SARS-CoV-2, and they were very accurate. And then they turned the dogs on people with long COVID. And they found that 50% of the people with long COVID still had active virus in them, even though it wasn't showing up on PCR, right? So according to the dogs, at least, 50% of them still had active COVID. Okay, so next we'll look at, let's see, I have this chart here. That's not really that important. I want to make sure we stay on time more or less so that there's time for questions here. So let's see, well, so now we can sort of get into this, how is a mast cell activated? Although how it's activated, so there are so many different ways that mast cells can be activated. And essentially, a lot of these problems will come from either a mast cell being too sensitive, because you don't really necessarily want to inhibit all of these ways that mast cells are activated, even though some people end up doing that, because that can end up causing problems with many other processes, right? So it is a good idea to know, gee, a lot of immunoglobulins can activate mast cells, and cytokines and neuropeptides, complement proteins, and all of these types of things. One important thing is this intracellular calcium mobilization. That's something that's good to know, because, you know, calcium mobilization can cause a lot of other problems, right? So for example, excitotoxicity, we can use calcium channel blockers to help reduce that effect. And one of the calcium channel blockers that's needed by the body a lot is magnesium. So if that magnesium can actually help some people greatly with MCAS, and that's one of the mechanisms that it may be using in that. In terms of treatment targets, the standard treatment targets, I wanted to go through some of those, because this is how, as you know, this is how people are being treated typically, is trying symptom management, because again, as a syndrome, that is the therapeutic goal, is to manage the symptoms. And so, we can go through some of these as to, how they're being treated, and what, there are also some natural products, some herbs or things like that you could also either add in or try out if some of these other things aren't working. So for anaphylaxis, we're using epinephrine, and I have one patient that has anaphylaxis pretty much every day. It's just, if she were to do epinephrine every day, I don't even know what would happen to her. So fortunately, the herbs that I prescribe for her, I'm able to stop the anaphylaxis, or at least really turn it down to where it's not a problem for her every night. But she is definitely my most difficult patient. And I have not been able to solve the triggers for that yet, but she's responded at least well to that. And again, anaphylaxis is something that even in Chinese medicine, we try to really just stop. We don't try to, help it out any something like that. So you can use some of these herbs. I put some of these components, this inula, japonica, the fritillaria. These citations are to the PMIDs. I'm sure you guys know what those are. You go to PubMed and you can just throw in the PMID, and the study will come up, so you can follow up on these if you want more details about dosages they're using and all this kind of thing. Histamines, as we all know, everybody's put on these sort of H1, H2 blockers initially to see if their MCAS is going to respond to those, and they try all kinds of different permutations and combinations. So there are also some herbs. Again, you can use inula, japonica is one of them, and there are a number of others. Okay, so I didn't. So that there are other things that we can do from a histamine standpoint. I only put that one there. Prostaglandins is another target. So people often take aspirin to inhibit PGD2. Curcumin can also inhibit that. The leukotrienes, so people are put on, anti-leukotriene therapies, but it turns out that St. John's wort can also inhibit leukotrienes, and it can help with, depression and things like that as well. Curcumin can also inhibit leukotriene production, the ALOX5 and COX inhibitor as well. mast cell sensitivity. This is more of the target that I tend to use more. So there's more things on there because I don't like to inhibit the mast cells themselves, but I like to not make them as trigger happy, right? And so I find most people tend to do very well if their mast cells can just be regulated and they're not constantly in the state of hyperactive mast cell activation. So, people are put on cromolyn and so forth to stabilize their mast cells, but actually there's some studies showing that quercetin is more effective than cromolyn. So that may be something if you want a little bit of a more natural approach from that standpoint. Lactoferrin's another one that's more natural, that can help stabilize mast cells. We talked about quercetin inhibiting that. Wulingsan is a Chinese herbal formula that has some research on it showing that it inhibits degranulation of mast cells. Ume inhibits mast cell degranulation. So ume is the Japanese plum, right? Well, it's Chinese too, but the umeboshi plum. They're very sour, but at any rate, you can have those regularly. Those can help inhibit mast cell degranulation. Lycopus lucidus reduces mast cell sensitivity. Again, that's the Inula japonica, has a lot of targets for that. It's a very useful herb. We use that a lot in Chinese medicine. Peonia alba is another one we use a lot. This inhibits mast cell activation for multiple targets. Again, you have all the citations here, and you can follow up. Corticosteroids, I really don't like using corticosteroids for things. I don't like it when my patients are on them. Some people just have to be on them it's the only thing that would control something, but they have awful side effects. And I can say I don't actually have any right now, any MCAS patients right now that are on corticosteroids, but once in a while, there's nothing else that's going to work for them. But many of my patients, the corticosteroids didn't work. Again, that's why they're seeing me. And then there's this other formula that there was some research for. But I do want to mention with these herbal formulas, when you see herbs and formulas where there's research for them, and there's this idea that, oh, gee, here's an herb or here's a formula, I should add that and try that out, right? Well, the thing is these herbs are very much like pharmaceuticals. People look at herbs and they think, oh, it's just like my mint tea. And it's true, mint is a Chinese, Chinese use mint as part of its herbal medicine, and licorice and ginger and all these things that are relatively, safe. But there are also a lot of herbs in the Chinese pharmacopoeia that are not safe, that are toxic, and you need to know what you're doing. You need to know how to prescribe them. They're safe when they're prescribed in the proper doses, but you need to know what to look for. And so again, it's not that you can't prescribe them or use them, but be very sure that you know everything about that plant before you start taking it, is my advice, or you're consulting with somebody who does know what's going on with that. And then finally, I wanted to put this in here because this was something I had heard a sort of talk by Lawrence Afrin. I don't know if you guys know him. But he's very much in the MCAS. He does a lot of work in this area, and there was this. I put a citation down below where he made some recommendations. I've treated, maybe definitely less than 100, somewhere between 50 and 100 COVID patients, and we've used, even with my MCAS patients, we've used Chinese herbal medicine, and that's pretty much what we used. We didn't add in antihistamines or things like that. However, this person made specific recommendations, and I thought you guys might be interested in it, so I put those there. So he basically says that you should take, an H1 and H2 blocker at a bare minimum plus a benzo, and then add in, maybe one or two of these other things that if they're helpful for you or they do. We use quercetin a lot, anyways. I do use that. I recommend everybody who gets it have quercetin, who gets COVID, for example, having quercetin and vitamin D and vitamin C. That's a standard part of my recommendations during that time. But I don't use CBD for that, although CBD has been very useful for some of my patients. And I think that's pretty much what I've got for you guys. I hope I didn't go too far over. I tried for 30 minutes. But are there any questions?
If everyone could just funnel their questions into the chat, and then we'll ask Dr. Horn.
Okay. Am I on?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, go ahead.
How do you know, what are the signs and symptoms of MCAS?
You mean, here, let me pull up the thing because I have a whole list of them. Here we go. Pull that
Billed
slide.
as a defeat the mandates rally at Coachella, where
They
people
are-
nothing totally
are
unprotected.
the
And you were
typical-
wondering,
Everyone
what
go
are the
on.
speakers they lined up for this meeting of the minds? The answer is this kind.
Hello? Can
Hello?
you guys hear me?
Yes,
Do you see these?
yes.
Oh, okay, great. So those are the main ones. Those are the ones that are usually used in the diagnosis. For that, you usually have to have at least two systems involved. And they need to be, as it says, episodic, reiterated, and unexplained. So if you have your lungs involved and you have your, and you have diarrhea, so you have wheezing and diarrhea, that's two symptoms, or two systems, sorry. So then that would qualify.
So this has been a conversation about MCAS, right?
Yes,
Came in
Yeah.
a little late.
yes. Yes, it is.
Uh,
I just wanted to make a comment on that slide, Brandon.
Uh-huh.
Some of us who have had vaccine reactions have been diagnosed with MCAS, but we don't have that typical picture that you're showing. We don't really have the allergic phenomenon, but more of a neuropathy type of picture, and
Uh-huh.
which I think is a little unusual, but it's been explained to me that the mast cells are in close proximity to the nerve cells in the dermis. And when the mast cells go crazy and release all of their, chemokines, cytokines, they can irritate the nearby nerve cells and therefore cause a neuropathy. And that's, a lot of us are experiencing that.
Yeah, it can be, I mean, it could be I mean, unless you've seen some data on that, that could be just more of a sort of how you're a physician too, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so we sort of know a little, we know the physiology and then we kind of guess based
Right.
on what we know of physiology. But there are many other things that can cause these type of neuropathies, right? So
Right.
just as an example, we know that COVID, and also I've seen this many times with vaccines because I've seen a number of vaccine reactions, herpes viruses tend to get reactivated, right? And as you know, herpes viruses are residing in nervous, in the nerves. And so there could be involvement of herpes viruses in some of these instances. We also know that, we can get peripheral neuropathies from B vitamin deficiencies, right? So these could be coming up from there. There's so many different things, from blood sugar abnormalities can cause, peripheral neuropathies. There are all kinds of different, angles that could lead to that. Just out of curiosity, are they, in terms of the diagnoses, are they, is it diagnosed just from labs, from elevated tryptase, or is it, how is the diagnosis happening if there aren't these sort of signs and symptoms, the typical ones?
Well, it varies. Personally, I have a very high tryptase. I never had a symptom of MCAS prior to being vaccinated. So whether it was pre-existing or not, it's hard to know. But in some people, their lab work it doesn't really reveal MCAS, but they respond very well to H1 and H2 blockers. So it's kind of a presumptive diagnosis, or to a low histamine diet, which many of us are on. So, that it's diagnosed in that way too. Because like you said, it's very difficult to always, to find a high tryptase, even in patients who have MCAS, because of the limitations in the blood collection and blood testing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it varies a lot, but some of us have, lab abnormalities that support that diagnosis. This person asks, can MCAS be cured or reversed, or is it a lifetime condition requiring symptom management? If it can be cured or reversed, how long does it take for someone who has MCAS to require needing medication and treatment?
Okay, so yes, it can be cured, it can be reversed, but not in everyone. It just depends. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to go through this whole, I tried to crunch, a lot into a short period of time. But basically, that's why I wanted to go into how the MCAS can come about. So let's say it's coming about because because of the virus itself, right? And that could be even post-vaccine because people become much more susceptible to the virus after they get vaccinated, right? So in those situations, the MCAS, it can be a response to a persistent viral infection. And so if you help the body to get control of that virus, then your MCAS will go in remission. Now, it's impossible for someone to say that it's going to be cured, because what do you really mean by a cure, right? So, I mean, I've treated people and it's gone away, but I don't know what's going to happen 10 years from now. I don't know if it's ever going to come back or not. So I can't necessarily say cure, but I can say we can get to the point where you don't need treatment, where you're not symptomatic. Now, whether something could trigger that to come back out, I can't say for sure, but I can tell you definitely these things can be reversed. Now, there are certain things that make it more difficult to reverse. So let's say, hypothetically, your own body is producing the spike, right? Because there is some sort of genome integration that's happening, and we don't have an answer to that yet from the vaccines. Then it may be tougher, then it may be a question of just trying to get that under control. So, and as some of the cross-reactivity things that can happen, those things, what I find is that if you can knock things down, if you can treat, and this becomes a little difficult because technically the way we approach it in Chinese medicine is a little different, but once we stabilize a person for a period of time, and we can keep them from being triggered for a period of time, you get a new set point, right? So that, we can reverse a lot of things. And if you're familiar with, for example, it's very similar to IgG. If you guys are familiar with IgG allergies, right? I mean, it's not technically, not to get into the technical aspects of whether IgG is sensitivities or technically allergies, but let's say you have a food sensitivity, right? And some to potatoes, right? Potatoes trigger your IgG, you have an IgG reaction. If you stay completely away from potatoes for 6 months, you will likely no longer be reacting to it. So there is a period of time where the body loses its sensitivity for that. IgE is different. IgE can last much longer. That's not as easy. That, though, IgE can also be desensitized. So there are a lot of desensitization techniques, some of them conventional. I have, a friend of mine, one of our good friends, is that he's an ER physician, and his wife is a microbiologist. And their child has an anaphylactic peanut allergy, and she went and had that desensitized by normal allergy techniques. And in the past, that was not possible. And so now they have ways of doing that, and we may be using similar things to desensitize people. So we need to look at each person with MCAS and try to figure out what the likely sort of path was for them to arrive at MCAS, and what the likely triggers are. Because as you mentioned, the actual, whether or not something is actually MCAS is very difficult. It's very difficult to figure out if somebody actually has it. And then if they do, what does that mean, right? All it means is a syndrome is that you're in a sense responding to a particular treatment or not. It doesn't, because we don't know the etiology, we don't know the causative factors, it's very difficult. It's a very amorphous type of thing. So the answer is depending on each person's particular particulars, many of these cases can be reversed in the sense that they don't need treatment anymore and they're fine. And some of them can't. Like I have one patient that is just very tough. The only thing that I've been able to do is control her anaphylaxis. I have not been able, she has chronic urticaria from a vaccine injury. It's chronic urticaria, and that has been, for me, that has been my, the thing that I keep trying to approach it from all these angles. So that happens, but many of my cases have just resolved completely. So, I wish I could predict ahead of time, and I could, a little bit. The ones that it's more viral oriented, they tend to be a little bit easier. Sometimes some of the vaccine ones I've had some, particularly the nervous system ones, those have seemed to have responded well. I had several cases of paralysis, for example, that responded well to it, and we were able to completely reverse the paralysis that came after the vaccine. So
That's great. A few more questions. I'll start from the bottom here. Do you have recommendations for people who are having trouble tolerating high histamine food and how to add them back into your diet? That's tough. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, so what do you mean? So the question is what do you mean by high histamine food? Because so as you know, like, you have leftovers, and that's high, that ends up being a high histamine food. I'm not sure, if you mean, like you want to start eating a lot of, let's say, I don't know, kimchi or something. These things can be difficult because it's going to have to do with why your body and how your body is responding to the histamine. Of course, there's ways of inhibiting histamine. I gave, there's some herbs you can take. But why those are triggering histamine in your body is you're not able to break it down well. So some people take that, Dow or things like that to, try to help breaking down the histamine. There can be, genetic reasons for it. So it's really going to depend on yourself. But again, what I find is once you calm the body down in general, then you can begin tolerating many things a lot more, even, some high histamine foods. Now, if you go out and you have sausages and beer and all of this, it's tough. Most of my patients, even though, many of them they'll reverse and they don't have the symptoms, it's not like they can now go out and eat beer and eat sausages and everything. When they go back to alcohol is one of the biggest problems. I would say if there was going to be one thing that I would say would be the worst, it would be alcohol. And that's also one thing that a lot of people just don't like to give up. So cannabis, I tell people, look, if you need something mind altering, try cannabis. Cannabis, at least the CBD in the cannabis may inhibit some of the reactivity and can help in some of the people. So.
Right. There's a doctor who's been studying long COVID and vaccine reaction patients, and he has found persistent spike protein in monocytes. And this person asks that if the spike proteins are continuously being produced, then is it expected that MCAS will be an ongoing issue? I think you answered that in a different way, but we just don't really know the mechanism yet.
Yeah, I mean, if in those particular cases, oftentimes, if you can help the body get rid of the virus or put the virus into a latent state where it's not really coming out and bothering you, then you can get rid of that problem. When it's vaccine induced, that may, if it does incorporate into the DNA, that would be a little more of an issue. That it's not going to be so easy. I mean, maybe you can use methylation and try to somehow shut off that particular, response, which your body can do if you can figure out the right combination to get it to do that, because just because you have something in your genes doesn't mean that it's going to express that way.
All right. Another question is, can MCAS affect the cardiovascular system?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as you see, even, and that was one of the things, I mean, the mast cells can, do have a lot of influence on the cardiovascular system. They're involved in vasodilation, they're involved in repair, then they could be involved in an injury as well.
Yeah. And another question is, let's see, that a lot of people who have vaccine reactions have headaches characterized by pressure in this and pressure in the head and scalp tightness. Is that what you have seen in long haul patients? I think that's what the question is.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that's an extremely common, presentation for many things. It's very non-specific, but yeah, we've treated that in all kinds of different people. So I don't see that that's specific for. I mean, it is one of the symptoms of MCAS. But it's certainly, again, it's certainly not specific to it.
And a couple more questions. Could MCAS be the reason for a low white blood cell count?
I mean, it certainly could. It's very difficult to say because MCAS again is a syndrome, right? It's not a disease. We don't know the cause. So in one person, the actual cause may be, X, and in another person, it may be Y. And depending what X or Y is would depend on whether that could actually lead to leukopenia or something like that.
Right. Many of us have been found to have some hematological abnormalities. And
Yeah.
how much MCAS is playing a role, it's hard to know.
Yeah, I mean, because it is part of right, it does come from the bone. It's part of it's part of your blood system, right? I mean, it's part of your white blood cells. So if your body is prioritizing mast cells, then it only has a limited amount of energy. It has a limited amount of resources, limited amount of stem cells, right? So it's going to affect other areas of other hematological markers will be affected for sure.
So it can cause high white blood cell count too, right?
You could have both. You could have high or low. Yeah. Yeah, you can. I mean, it is a white blood cell, right?
Right.
So if you have a lot of mast cells, you could have a high white blood cell count, right?
And this question, I'm not sure how it connects with MCAS, but any thoughts on benzodiazepine withdrawal?
Can they be a little more specific? What you mean? Just is there a problem stopping it, or?
Glenn, do you want to talk about that? Is Glenn still on? Let's see. Glenn.
Sorry, I got a little distracted. What's the question again?
Oh, you had asked a question about benzodiazepine withdrawal.
Oh yeah, the issue there. Some people would say that that the withdrawal effects can be very severe. Like for some people, it takes like a year for them to safely get off benzodiazepines.
Okay.
And
so
is that something you've encountered? Or?
I haven't really had as much a problem with that, but we treat, in Chinese medicine, we treat a lot of withdrawal symptoms. There are actually protocols for drug withdrawal symptoms, even actually, for even for, all kinds of, there's I forget where it is, but there was some court, I think it was in New York, maybe it was New York City, where they told people who were addicted to various kinds of, I think it was methamphetamines, that the judge said you can go to jail or you can go to acupuncture for detoxing from it. So acupuncture can be very helpful for drug withdrawal. So most of my patients are not going to have very long-term withdrawal symptoms from the things that they're trying to get off. So I'm not going to be a very good judge of that, because we have literally hundreds of chemicals, hundreds of different herbs, even in my office, just in my office, that we can combine in various ways to try to, counteract some of these things and help people with withdrawal. We just do this with steroid withdrawals. We do this with, all kinds of medications that people are on when their physicians want to get them off of the medications or change them up.
Okay.
does anyone else have any questions? I think we went through the whole list here.
Okay.
I have another question, Brandon. Where is your center located, and do you see patients virtually?
Yeah, I do. We see patients virtually, but the location is you're in LA, so
I am, but we have people from all over the world actually who are part of our group.
Oh, okay. So, I was just in terms of describing where it is. It was by Highland Park in South Pasadena area. So it's maybe 5 minutes north of downtown, 5 to 10 minutes right off the 110 freeway. Okay. So, but yes, we also do. We also consult remotely as well.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a lot to offer as an adjunct to the other types of treatments that we've been struggling with.
Yeah, I mean, if people are local, it's definitely worth doing in-person visits. They're actually less expensive than online, and there are things you can tell from physical exams that you can't tell from just from labs and from talking to somebody. And looking at pictures of them.
How did you get interested in Chinese medicine?
I got sick. I actually had a vaccine reaction, believe it or not. I didn't know it was a vaccine reaction until much later, because once we ended up tracing it back, we found that 2 weeks before I had had a Hep B vaccine, and so so it just happened to be right when antibodies peaked. I started getting these neurological problems. But yeah, I was an attorney. I was a tax attorney at the time, so it was but it, you know, doesn't, if you don't have your health, it doesn't do much good, whatever you're doing. So that's how I got interested initially.
Great. Well, if no one else has any questions, I guess we'll close it up, and thank you very much for helping us with this very interesting topic. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Oops, I saw another question here.